Hello and welcome to lesson 7 of this basic Greek course. Let's take a look at the content that we will cover in this lesson. Today we will be looking at future active and future middle indicative verb endings. Then we will look at the concept of amalgamation. Thereafter we will learn about compound and deponent verbs. Then we will introduce our new vocabulary in this lesson, and applying that vocab and the various concepts, we will do some translation work together. So if you're ready, let's get going. I'd like to begin by giving you an overview of the future tense form. So the first point says there, the future tense form relates to something that has not yet happened and primarily refers to a future time frame from the author's perspective. Then, the predictive use of the future is the most common use of the future tense form and predicts a future event, or at least indicates the expectation that something will take place from the author's perspective. So consider these two New Testament examples that reinforce the predictive use of the future. The first one comes from Mark 1 verse 8, where Mark writes, autos baptisei humas en pneumatai hagio. Translated, he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. And there we see the predictive use coming out strongly with the helping verb will. The second example from Mark 9 verse 31 says, meta tres hemeras anastasetai. Translated, after 3 days he will rise. That's referring to Jesus. So that was a prediction of his resurrection from the dead. So both these examples communicate very strongly the predictive use of the future tense form. I'd also like to remind you of the Greek inflectional system, because in the future tense we are going to see some spelling changes taking place. So remember that Greek verbs, like nouns, are highly inflected. That is, they are able to change or be altered in many different ways. Inflection refers to the spelling changes that words undergo to reflect their grammatical function in a sentence. Inflection in Latin means I bend. So inflected words are bent or modified from the stem's simplest form. For instance, Greek verbs can add various morphemes. All right, and we're going to see an example of that today. Morphemes are the smallest units of meaning, and the various examples are prefixes, suffixes, and sometimes even the stem, which is the root form of the verb, can be slightly altered. The last thing that I want to remind you of are the present active indicative verb endings of luo. So the first person singular is luo, second person singular, lueis, third person singular, luei. First person plural, luamen, second person plural, luete, third person plural, luusin. So once again, that's luo, lueis, luei, luamen, lueta, luusin. So previously, when I introduced you to the Greek verb, I showed you the components of a Greek verb. And we looked at the stem, the connecting vowel, and the personal ending. And when looking at the present verb endings, our example was lu, are, men. But as you can see here, there's an additional component called the tense formative. Now, the tense formative is formed by inserting a sigma between the present tense stem, and the connecting vowel. This sigma is called the tense formative because it helps form the future tense. So you can also think of this as the sign of the future, the sigma. So when you see the sigma, you more than likely are going to have the future tense. So let's take a closer look now at the future active indicative with Luso. So based on our previous slide, we see that the sign of the future is the sigma, which comes after the stem of the verb and before the connecting vowel and the verb ending. So let's go through our paradigms now. The first person singular is Luso, second person singular, Lusace, third person singular, Lusay, first person plural, Lusamen, second person plural, Lusete, and third person plural, Lususin. So one more time, Luso, Lusace, Lusay, Lusamen, Luseta, Lususin. So now that you are familiar with the verb endings of the future active indicative, we now need to turn our attention to the translation of this future tense form. And in order to do that, we also need to consider the verbal aspect once again. So just to remind you of verbal aspect, the definition that we introduced in lesson 2 was this, that it is the subjective perspective or viewpoint from which an author communicates the action of a given verb. And we also learned that there are 3 types of verbal aspect, 2 true aspects with a hybrid third. And those again are the imperfective, the perfective, and the stative verbal aspects. The imperfective verbal aspect consists of the present and imperfect tense forms. And up to now, we have covered the present tense forms together. The next verbal aspect is the perfective, and that consists of the aorist and future tense forms. And I just made a comment here. It says there that the future tense form is somewhat of an anomaly among Greek verbs because it is regarded, at least by some, as aspectually neutral. In other words, it doesn't seem to quite fit into any of the verbal aspects. However, some scholars recognize that it has close affinity to the perfective verbal aspect, and I am one of those scholars, and so we are going to include the future tense form under the umbrella of the perfective verbal aspect. And then finally, the stative verbal aspect consists of the perfective and pluperfect tense forms. So with that said, let's take a closer look now at the perfective verbal aspect. So remember, we are now looking at the future active indicative verb endings. The indicative mood reminds us that this is a statement that is being made, and the indicative mood is the only mood where time is significant. The active voice reminds us that the subject is doing the action of the verb, and then the future tense is related to the perfective verbal aspect. So the perfective verbal aspect is where the author or speaker is describing an action as a whole without reference to when it began or when it ended. So the perspective, should I say, of the author is not focusing on how the action occurred, but simply describing it as a whole. And specifically, an action that will take place sometime in the future. And therefore, we need to translate it within that framework. So having said that, let's now look at how we would translate the future active of Luso. So Luso, we would translate as I will loose. The second person singular, lusace, we would translate as you will loose. The third person singular, lusay, we would translate as he, she, it will loose. First person plural, loosamen, we would translate as we will loose. Second person plural, loosete, we would translate as you will loose. And then finally, the third person plural, lususin, we would translate as they will loose. All right, so in English, we provide the helping verb will to communicate the future tense form of the Greek. Sometimes it's important that we step back from all the trees, metaphorically speaking, and look at the forest as a whole. So this is what this slide is essentially about, looking at the forest as a whole, or in other words, looking at where we're going. So the 6 different tense forms of the verbs are almost universally called the principal parts. So that is a term that you will frequently come across in basic Greek curriculums and textbooks. But I prefer, as does William Mounce, the term tense forms to describe these different forms of the verbs. So in the table below is a summary of these forms. We have the present active, future active, aorist active, aorist middle passive, perfect active, and perfect middle passive. All right, so I don't want to overwhelm you at this point, but those are all the various tense forms that we are going to learn. So far, we have only learned the present active, the tense form being luo, and the future active, which we've now recently covered, and that is loose-o. So we are making progress. You still have a long way to go, and I pray that you will persevere in your journey of learning this incredible language. But I hope that this has just been helpful for you to step back from the woods and all the little details that we are looking at and see the tree and the forest as a whole. It's now time to look at the future middle indicative of luso. But before we look at that, I just want to remind you of the present middle passive indicative verb endings with luo. So the first person singular was luamai, second person singular luai, third person singular luetai, first person plural luametha, second person plural lueste, third person plural luantai. So if you remember, in the present tense, the middle and passive forms are the same. But in the future, as we're going to see now, the form of the middle is distinct from both the active and the passive. You might be wondering, well, are we also going to learn the passive forms today? The answer to that is no. I'm going to reserve the future passive for when we learn the aorist verb endings, because there are some similarities there between the aorist passive and the future passive. So you'll be glad to know that the future middle indicative is formed by the same principles as the future active indicative. So have a look here at the components of a Greek verb. Once again, we have our stem, we have the sign of the future, which again is the sigma, we have our connecting vowel, and our personal ending. So instead of seeing it as luamai, you are now going to see it as lusamai. So let's look at the various forms together. So the future middle indicative with luso are as follows. The first person singular is lusamai, second person singular lusei, third person singular lusetai, first person plural lusametha, second person plural luseste, third person plural lusantai. Right, so Once again, you have the sigma coming after the stem of the verb and before the verb endings. Now, as we consider translate in the future middle with Luso, we are going to use the same framework, the perfective verbal aspect. The only difference now is that we are referring to the middle voice. So the middle voice, if you remember, is where the subject acts in its own interest. And because it acts in its own interest, we are going to supply these various phrases in the English, for myself, for yourself, for itself, for ourselves, for yourselves, and for themselves. All right, so that's really the only difference between the future active indicative and the future middle indicative, is by looking at the voices. So let's go ahead now and look at the translations. The first person singular, loosomai, is translated as I will loose for myself. Second person singular, loosei, you will loose for yourself. Third person singular, loosetai, he, she, it will loose for itself. First person plural, loosometha, translated as we will loose for ourselves. Second person plural, looseste, translated as you will loose for yourselves. And finally, the third person plural, loosontai, is translated as they will loose for themselves. The next concept that I want to deal with in this lesson is amalgamation. So what is amalgamation? It is when the stem of a verb ends with a consonant, and that consonant combines with the sign of the future, which, as we've learned, is the sigma, to form a different letter. So this combination of consonants is what we refer to as amalgamation. So let's look at a very helpful chart that will help us with understanding amalgamation. So the following chart illustrates the various combinations. So we have labials, which are letters pronounced with the lips. We have velars, which are letters pronounced with the soft palate. And then we have dentals, which are letters pronounced with the teeth. So here you see those combinations here, the labials, the velars, and the dentals. And here are examples of each one of them. The labials are the P, the beta, and the phi, which are pronounced with the lips. The velars are the kappa, the gamma, and the ki, pronounced with the soft palate. And the dentals are the letters are tau, delta, theta, and zeta, pronounced with the teeth. Now, as you can see here, when these final consonants of a stem meet a sigma, they are going to amalgamate and change their form. So when a labial meets a sigma, it becomes a psi. When a velar meets a sigma, it amalgamates to form a xi. And when a dental meets a sigma, it amalgamates and fortunately stays a sigma. So take a look at these examples for each one. Here we have grapho, right, where we have the example of phi, right, plus a sigma. The new word now is grapso. Then we have our next example, ago. All right, so we have here the gamma plus a sigma gives us our new word axo. And then finally, we have patho. We have the example of the theta plus a sigma, and the word becomes peso. Let's take a look at some more examples together. So let's take a look at some more examples of amalgamation together. And just to remind you, amalgamation is when the stem of a verb ends with certain consonants, and those consonants have been classified into various combinations, the labials, the velars, and the dentals, and when they meet the sigma, then there is amalgamation and the letter changes. So here's the first example. The word is blepsusi. Now this is how you would find the form in the Bible, and when you see the psi, you need to ask yourself what has taken place there, and more than likely amalgamation. And as we have a look here, by breaking down the word, we can see here that the original word was blepusi, so the P has amalgamated with the sigma to form the new word blepsusi with a psi. Take a look at the next example with me. We have the word aksontai, and when you see the xi, you need to ask yourself what type of amalgamation has taken place. So the original word was agontai, where the gamma has amalgamated with the future sign of the future, the sigma, to form this new word aksontai. Now take a look at this next word, and the word is didasco. And this often throws people off because you see the sigma there and you expect it to automatically be a future tense form. However, you should be aware that the future of didasco is actually didaxo. So the stem of didasco is duck. Alright, so didasco is the present tense form. So when you see didasco plus a sigma, you then get the future form, which is didaxo. Right, you see the amalgamation taking place there before the omega. So let's do an example from the Greek New Testament together. So here is an example of amalgamation in the Greek New Testament, and the example comes from James 4 verse 7, where James writes, Hupatagete un to theo, antistete de to, diabolo, kai, fuxatai, af humon. And this is my own translation of James 4 verse 7. It says, therefore submit to God, but resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Alright, so the word we want to look at here is fuxatai, and we see the xi there, and we need to ask ourselves, why is it there? And it's because of amalgamation. So we see that the original verb is fugatai, where the gamma has amalgamated with the sigma to form this word that we see in the New Testament, fuxatai, which is translated as he will flee. Here is a very catchy song that I pray will help you to remember the future active and middle verb endings, as well as to reinforce the concept of amalgamation. Enjoy.
When I'm looking at the future, what do I see? I see a sigma there looking right back at me. A sigma right before the endings I already know. For future active and middle, but not for passive. Here's how it goes. So say, future active singular. Summon seta susi, future active plural. Now middle, some I say setai, future middle singular. some methods that's the sometime, future middle plural. Now I have to tell you that it's not as easy as that. Future stems may be quite different, so knowing principal parts is really, really good. And I'll teach you some rules, here's how they go. That troublesome sigma, interacting with the stops, may change the letters or drop them out. Labials plus sigma results in C, and palatals plus sigma results in C. And what about those dentals? They tend to lose their teeth. A dental plus sigma, and the sigma's all you'll see. Now there are some stems that look a little different if they end with zeta or a double consonant. There used to be a delta or a palatal. So apply the rules and you can tell. When I'm looking at the future, what do I see? I see sigma there looking right back at me.
The next section of this lesson are compound verbs. So what is a compound verb? Here's a definition. Compound verbs are verbs that have a preposition prefixed, that means added, to their stem. And we have two types of compounds based on how easy it is to determine the meaning of a compound verb. So the first type of compound verb is called a transparent compound. And this is when their meanings can be easily determined from the combination. So for example, we have ek balo, and that's translated as I throw out. So you should be familiar with your vocab. Ek, the preposition, means out, and the verb balo means I throw. So together, this compound verb can be translated as I throw out. So the meaning is easily determined. But sometimes the meaning is not very easily discernible, and that is what we call our opaque compounds, when the meaning is not easily discernible from the combination. And the example here is apocrinomai. Now, if we had to translate apocrinomai literally, we would translate it as I judge from, because chrono means judge or distinguish, and the preposition apo means from. So literally, we would expect to translate this as I judge from. But because this is a opaque compound that's not easily discernible, it actually means I answer. So you just need to learn that from your vocabulary, that apocrinomai means I answer. All right, so compound verbs are verbs that have a preposition prefixed to their stem. Let us now take a look at deponent verbs. So here's a definition for a deponent verb. Deponent verbs are verbs that have the form of middle or passive verbs, but the meaning of active verbs. So they should be passed as middle or passive verbs, but translated as active. Now, the common deponent verbs must be memorized, and you can determine whether or not verbs are deponent by checking their sources in a lexicon. So here's an example. A lexical form with a middle or passive ending is deponent. So look at the example here, urkamai. So we can see here we have the ending amai, which tells us that it is middle or passive, and therefore it's more than likely going to be a deponent verb, which means that it looks like we're going to translate it as middle or passive, but we actually translate it as an active voice, as though the subject were doing the action of the verb. It's now time to look at our vocabulary for lesson 7. And before we go through each word, I just want to identify the deponent verbs. Remember, deponent verbs are verbs that are middle and passive in form, but we are going to translate them with an active voice. So I'm going to now just identify all those deponent verbs for you because we see the middle passive form in them. Right, so there's quite a few in this vocab, as you can see. All right, so all these words that I have highlighted have a middle passive verb ending. All right, so don't get confused and think now that you need to translate it as middle or passive. Because they're deponent, we translate them with an active meaning. And we'll do an example just now in our translation exercise. All right, so let's go through the vocab together. Our first word here is aperkamai. Aperkamai, which means I go away or I depart. Our next word is apokrinomai. Remember, this is a opaque compound, which means I answer, and it takes its object in the dative case. Then we have a verb, baptizo, baptizo, which means I baptize. Next we have ginomai, ginomai, which can be translated as I become, I am, I happen, I come into existence. You'll have to discern from the context which is the best translation of ginomai. Next we have a adjective, dikaios, which is the masculine, dikaia, the feminine, dikaion, the neuter gender. Because remember, an adjective must be able to have all three genders, and that's righteous. And then we have ace erkamai, which means I come in, I enter. Then we have ekbalo, which is a transparent compound verb, which means I throw out or I cast out. Next we have exerkamai, which means I go out. And I see that I missed the deponent verb here. This one is erkamai, which means I come or I go. Then we have a verb again, lambano, I take or I receive. Next we have a noun, nomosha, which means law. And then we have this, what we call a negative particle, which is u, uk, and uch. U, uk, and uch, which we translate as no or not. Next we have paruamai. Paruamai means I go. And then we have prosukamai. This is also an example of an opaque compound. Prosukamai, which means I pray. And then finally, we have Christos ha, which is translated as Christ or Messiah. So our first example for today, the Greek reads, akuse ha dikaios mathetes tous nomus apa tu kuriou. So as you are familiar with now, I have completed the passing sheet for us just for the sake of time. So here are all the words that I've placed in this column. So let's have a look at the details of each word together. The first word there is akuse. All right, so we see the sigma which indicates that this is a future tense form. So it's a verb future, it's active, indicative, third person singular from a QA, which means he will hear. Then we have ha, which is an article. It's a nominative masculine singular. All right, and remember that whatever comes afterwards, whether it be an adjective or a noun, the article is going to agree with it in gender, number, and case. So here we have dikaios, which is an adjective from our vocab. It is also nominative masculine singular. And then we have mathetes, which is a noun. It's also nominative masculine singular. So ha dikaios mathetes, which is the righteous disciple. And just remember and take note of the nominatives here, because that will tell us that this is the subject of the sentence. Then we have tous, which is an article. It's accusative masculine plural. Then we have namus, which is a noun. It's accusative masculine plural. That means law. Next we have upper, which is a preposition. It takes its object in the genitive case. That's why I've put genitive there. We have the article to, all right, which is genitive masculine singular. And then we have kuriou, which is functioning as the object of the preposition. Although it is a noun, it's also in the genitive case. It's masculine gender and singular in person, which is the Lord. So let's go ahead and translate this together. So we know that our subject is the righteous disciple. So let's write that out there. The righteous disciple. All right, and then we have our verb, all right, akuse, which we translate as with will, the helping verb. So the righteous disciple will hear. What will he hear? Tous namus. He will hear the laws, all right, because as you can see here, it is a plural. The laws from the Lord. Right, so the translation reads, the righteous disciple will hear the laws from the Lord. Our next translation example reads, aperkometha, upper, tes, geis, pros, ton, kurion. So let's go through each word together and parse it. So the first word is aperkometha. It's a verb. It's a present tense form. The voice is middle. The mood is indicative. It's a first person plural. And the lexical form is aperkomai. All right, so this should start signaling some sounds in your mind. When you see the my ending, it's the middle form, which tells you that this is a deponent verb. So although we pass it as a middle in form, we are going to translate it with an active voice. So let's go ahead and translate that. So it's first person plural, so it's we are departing. Okay, if we did translate it with a middle voice, we would add in we are departing for ourselves. But this is deponent, so we translate it with an active voice. We are departing. Then we have upper. It's a preposition. It takes its object in the genitive case. That is why both tes and geis are in the genitive cases. They are feminine gender and singular in person. And gay means earth. Then we have pros, which is also a preposition. It takes its object in the accusative case. That is why both ton and kurion are in the accusative cases. They have masculine genders. They are singular in form, and kurios means Lord. So let's complete the rest of this translation. So we have, we are departing from Taisges, from the earth, proston kyrion, to the Lord. Right, so we are departing from the earth to the Lord.